Hi, and welcome to Grammar Lessons with Heather. In this lesson, we'll look at how to use conditionals. Let's get started. We'll begin our lesson with a question. What happens if you heat ice? Notice the if in this question. We use if because it's a conditional. But what kind? Our first example is what we call a zero conditional. We use the zero conditional to talk about general truths or facts. So, what happens if you heat ice? Well, if you heat ice, it melts. This is a fact or a general truth. Notice that with zero conditionals, we use the present simple in both clauses, the if clause and the main clause. Here's another kind of conditional. What will you do if it rains this weekend? Do you know what kind of conditional this is? It's the first conditional. We use this conditional to talk about the future when something is possible or real. If there's a real possibility of rain this weekend, use the first conditional. Let's break it down. The first conditional uses will in the main clause and the present simple in the if clause. Note that with any conditional sentence, we have two clauses. So there are two possible ways to construct our sentence. We can begin the sentence with the if clause. If it rains, I will stay home. Or we can put the if clause at the end of the sentence. I will stay home if it rains. But notice that when the if clause starts the sentence, it's always followed by a comma and a slight pause when we're speaking. Now, let's look at another conditional sentence. What would you do if it rained $50 bills? Do you notice a difference? This is a second conditional sentence. We use it to talk about either the present or the future, but it's different from the first conditional because it's imaginary. Let's look at this example answer. If it rained $50 bills, I would try to catch some. Notice that we use the past simple in the if clause and would in the main clause. When we use the second conditional, there's one thing to watch out for. Can you find the mistake in this sentence? If I was rich, I would buy a castle. Was is not correct. It should be, if I were rich, I would buy a castle. The rule with second conditional sentences is that we use were with any subject. So we would say, if I were rich, if he were rich, if they were rich. Now let's look at another type of conditional. What if you hadn't studied for the test? This is what we call a third conditional. We use the third conditional to talk about the past, but it's imaginary, so we use it to imagine the past differently. Forming the third conditional can be a little tricky. There are a lot of complicated verb tenses being used here. Here's an example answer. If I hadn't studied, I wouldn't have passed the test. Notice that we use the past perfect in the if clause, and we use would plus the present perfect in the main clause. One thing we need to consider when forming the third conditional is our use of positives and negatives. As the third conditional is used to imagine the opposite of what happened in the past, we need to look at turning negatives to positives and positives to negatives. So let's say that in real life, she studied and she passed. Both of these sentences are positive. So when we make the third conditional, if I hadn't studied, I wouldn't have passed, notice that Both actions are negative. It's the opposite. Here's an opposite example. In real life, she didn't study and she didn't pass. Both are negative, so our third conditional sentence will be positive and positive. And sometimes one action may have been positive and one negative, or one negative and one positive. For example, I didn't eat dinner. I was hungry. So our third conditional sentence will be positive and negative. It's the opposite. Now we have one final conditional to look at. What if I had invested in Bitcoin? This is called a mixed conditional. It's similar to the third conditional. It's also used to imagine the past differently, but it imagines a different present. Let's look at an example. If I had invested in Bitcoin, I would be rich. Just like the third conditional, we use the past perfect in the if clause, but we use would plus the base form of the verb in the main clause. Here's another example. If I hadn't eaten the extra piece of cake, I wouldn't feel so full. Notice that in the if clause, we're imagining a different past, while in the main clause, we're imagining a different present. Now that we've looked at each of the different types of conditionals, let's see if you can use what you learned to make some sentences on your own. Feel free to pause the video while you think about your answers. Number 1. I don't have enough money. I can't buy a house. See if you can complete the sentence. Let's check the answer. If I had more money, I would buy a house. This is the second conditional. It uses past plus would and talks about an imaginary situation in the future. Now try number 2. I didn't know the answers. I didn't pass the test. The answer is, if I had known the answers, I would have passed the test. This is a third conditional sentence. Both clauses refer to something imaginary in the past. Try number 3. I ate earlier. I'm not hungry. Here's the answer. If I hadn't eaten earlier, I wouldn't be hungry. This is a mixed conditional because the if clause refers to something imaginary in the past and the main clause to something imaginary in the present. Now, number 4. I might have time later, so I might call you. The answer is, if I have time later, I will call you. This is the first conditional. It uses the present tense with will and refers to something real in the future. Now here's one last question. Red plus blue equals purple. The answer is, if you mix red and blue, you get purple. This is an example of a zero conditional. It uses the present simple in both clauses and refers to a general truth or fact. That concludes this lesson. I hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching.